The yeas are 230, the nays are 196. The resolution is adopted. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. House will come to order. House will come to order. Members will take their conversations off the floor.
We ready? For what purpose does the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Loy, seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 131, I call up the conference report on the joint resolution HJ Res 31, making further continuing. Mr. Speaker, the House is not in order.
The gentlelady is correct. The House is not in order. Please cease your conversations. The gentlelady is recognized.
I call up the conference report on the joint resolution HJ Res 31, making further continuing appropriations for the Department of Homeland Security for fiscal year 2019 and for other purposes, and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the title of the joint resolution.
House Joint Resolution 31, making further continuing appropriations for the Department of Homeland Security for fiscal year 2019 and for other purposes.
Pursuant to House Resolution 131, the conference report is considered read. The gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Loy, and the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Granger, will each control 30 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from New York, Mrs. Loy.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Right.
Mr. Speaker, the bill before us would prevent another government shutdown by completing the remaining appropriation bills for fiscal year 2019. It represents what is possible in a strong democratic process when we work hard to reach agreement that puts politics aside and puts the American people first. This bipartisan compromise rejects the president's irresponsible budget cuts and instead invests in priorities that will strengthen our families, communities, and economy. Additionally, it does not contain poison pill riders that threaten the environment, public health, and consumer protections in the House Republican versions of these bills. Among the bill's vital increases are $80 million for state and local law enforcement to keep communities safe, $1 billion for the Census Bureau, $308 million for research and development at the National Science Foundation, $25 million for the Environmental Protection Agency, $293 million for port infrastructure, and $123 million for grants to combat homelessness. Strong international affairs funding will help stabilize the world economy, meet unprecedented humanitarian needs, and continue our fight against radical extremism and terrorism. Federal workers will receive a 1.9% pay raise that the president attempted to deny hardworking families. The Homeland Security division of this bill upholds democratic values, and funds smart and effective border security, including construction and screening technology at ports of entry, where most drugs illegally enter the country. The $1.375 billion it provides for border barriers is 76% less than what the President demanded for a concrete wall, and critical protections are put in place for environmentally sensitive areas. Neither Democrats or Republicans got everything you wanted. Every Democrat and nearly every Republican who served on the conference committee to write this bill has signed it in support. I thank the conferees for their hard work and commitment to this process, which we couldn't have completed without our excellent, dedicated staff, both majority and minority. And my friends, I urge a yes vote and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady reserves. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Granger.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of House Joint Resolution 31, a bipartisan plan to fund the Department of Homeland Security and the remaining appropriations bills for fiscal year 2019. Earlier this month, I had an opportunity to travel to the southern border to see firsthand the situation we face and hear from experts on the ground about the best way to address the crisis there. The President is correct. This is a crisis that must be addressed, both for the safety and security of the American people and for the well-being of those who are coming here. We have a responsibility to come together and support what experts on the border say they need to address this security and humanitarian crisis. While this bill falls short of what I would have liked to see, it will provide our Customs and Border Patrol and Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents the tools necessary to continue combating the threat we face. In particular, the bill provides $1.375 billion for 55 new miles of wall or physical border barriers, as well as additional technology to combat human and drug trafficking. It's a good down payment that will allow us to build new barriers in the areas that the Border Patrol says it needed most. The bill also supports immigration and customs enforcement priorities by funding detention beds at a higher level than the amount enacted last year. This will allow agents the flexibility to address surges in illegal immigration and apprehensions. It also does not include any limits on ICE enforcement actions that could cause dangerous criminals to be released into our country. The agreement prevents another unnecessary shutdown by including funding for the remaining unfunded appropriations bills: agriculture, commerce, justice, and science, financial services and general government, interior, state and foreign operations, transportation, housing, and urban development. By voting for these bills today and funding these vital areas of the federal government, we will secure America and our allies, promote economic prosperity, protect human life, promote the health and safety of all Americans, and make vital investments in our nation's infrastructure. Mr. Speaker, it would take hours to go through all the bipartisan provisions, including in this bill, so let me take a few minutes to discuss some of the highlights. They increase funding for federal law enforcement to combat terrorism, espionage, drug traffickers, gangs, and violent criminals, combat the financing of terrorism and terrorist groups, and strengthen the development and enforcement of sanctions against Iran, North Korea, Russia, and Cuba by providing increased funding for the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. We keep our commitment to Israel's security by fully funding the new Memorandum of Understanding. We encourage economic development and job creation in rural communities across the country. We We boost growth and development of America's small businesses by providing the opportunity to obtain capital through various Small Business Administration loan programs. We provide funding necessary to implement the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. This will ensure that American families are keeping more of their hard-earned dollars, our small businesses are empowered to grow and expand, and investments are flowing to communities that need it most. We maintain all pro-life language included in the various bills enacted during the 115th Congress under the Republican majority. We advance drug treatment and recovery initiatives and improve prevention and enforcement by investing in justice grant programs that support things like prescription drug monitoring and at-risk youth programs. We increase and focus funding on medical product safety, including funding to fight opioid abuse. We advance drug and biological product manufacturing within the United States and approve rare disease medications. We modernize generic drug development. We provide increased funding for the Department of the Interior and U.S. Forest Service to fight devastating wildfires that threaten our communities. And we ensure rural areas have the same access to basic utilities that urban areas do by investing in critical infrastructure. I want to thank my colleagues and friend, Chairwoman Lowy, for all her hard work in these negotiations. As always, she's been an honest broker and a tough negotiator throughout the process. And I look forward to continuing to work with her in this Congress. I also want to thank our partners on the other side of the Capitol, Senate Appropriations Committee Chairman Shelby and Vice Chairman Leahy for their hard work. And all the members of the Conference Committee, especially the House Republicans, Congressman Flashman, Palazzo, and Graves. Finally, I want to thank the hardworking staff of the Appropriations Committee for their tireless work over the last 3 weeks in particular. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this measure, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady reserves the balance of her time. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from New York.
Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 4 minutes to the hardworking gentlewoman from California, the chairwoman of the Homeland Security Committee, Ms. Roybal Allard.
Mr. Speaker, let me begin by thanking the ranking member of the subcommittee, Chuck Fleischmann, for the courteous way in which he represented and fought for the minority's priorities. The negotiations on the DH funding bill were among the hardest I have experienced to date. Although we did not win every battle, we won many. We prevented new funding for immigration enforcement field personnel. We secured funding to increase detention facility inspections from once every 3 years to twice a year. We won funding to increase detention facility compliance with the Prison Rape Elimination Act, to provide more victims assistance specialists, and to expand the Alternatives to Detention program, including $30.5 million for family case management. We held firm on a provision to prevent ICE from using information from the Office of Refugee Resettlement to detain and remove sponsors of unaccompanied children. And we improved transparency by requiring ICE to make information public about the numbers and categories of people in its custody. While I am not happy with the outcome on border fencing, we did limit funding for border fencing to only $1.375 billion, no higher than last year. We also won protections for several ecologically sensitive areas in Texas. And we secured hundreds of millions of dollars for humanitarian efforts to ensure migrants who spend time in CBP custody are appropriately cared for. Our bill also has large investments in equipment to detect drugs and other contraband at our ports of entry, where the real threat lies. The bill funds 600 new customs officers to help facilitate commerce and reduce wait times at the ports. The bill also includes funds for the Coast Guard's first heavy icebreaker in 40 years and provides robust support for FEMA preparedness and disaster response grants. Compared to the current detention bed level, we significantly reduced the funding available for ICE detention beds for the rest of this fiscal year. Unfortunately, we were unable to reach agreement on how to prevent OMB from giving ICE a blank check for detention beds during continuing resolutions, and we were unable to effectively prevent DHS abuse of its transfer authority to increase detention beds. That transfer authority is intended to address the unforeseen changes in circumstances. It is not to be used as a tool for routinely defying congressional intent on spending. As chair of the Homeland Security Appropriations Subcommittee, I will demand the Department to honor the intent of Congress and fully justify any use of its transfer authority. I will hold public hearings to ensure the American people know when that authority is being abused, and if not corrected, redouble my efforts to ensure that authority is taken away. While not a perfect bill, the only alternative to this negotiated bill is a year-long CR, which would not only include DHS. The fact is, federal agencies need full-year funding bills if we expect them to carry out their missions effectively, especially after the trauma of the longest partial government shutdown. It is time to put FY19 behind us so we can start in earnest on FY20 and the oversight opportunities it provides. I urge my colleagues to vote for the bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back the balance of her time. The gentlelady from Texas is recognized. The gentlelady from Texas controls the time.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Rogers.
The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of this legislation. But first, I want to congratulate our committee's distinguished chair and its ranking member on their masterful work in shepherding this compromise to the floor. This is a historic dynamic duo that we have in charge of our committee, and they produced a historic product that we have before us tonight. Mr. Chairman, we have a crisis at our southern border, period. There's no denying that our nation's security is threatened by the seemingly unending flow of drugs that find their way into nearly every American community, as well as the violence of the brutal cartels who profit from this trade. Where does it take place? On that border. So we do have a problem. It's an emergency. President Trump is absolutely correct that we can't allow this ruthless criminality to continue unchecked. This bill takes important steps to secure this country. $1.3 billion for further construction at the border, for a wall and additional resources for DHS to hire more personnel and deploy advanced technology in the region. But in addition to the security crisis, there's also a very real humanitarian crisis that we simply can't ignore. Thousands of vulnerable women and children seeking a better, safer life in the confines of this country. It's not the American way to turn our backs on these people, and that's precisely why we have processes under federal law to facilitate legal entry into our country. So this bill also takes important steps to enforce our current immigration laws. The bill funds an expansion of the Alternatives to Detention program and also increases attorney and courtroom staffing to reduce the backlog of currently pending immigration cases. While the challenges at our border have rightly grabbed headlines, the bill also funds a number of other important federal agencies through the end of the fiscal year. Importantly, it ensures that our dedicated public servants can continue to show up to work without fear of losing another paycheck. In my Kentucky district, for example, hundreds of federal prison employees showed up to a dangerous, difficult, often thankless job for over a month, not knowing when the next paycheck would come, if at all. I thank them, and I'm pleased to support this bill that will continue to support the Bureau of Prisons. Also for Kentucky, this bill continues our momentum in combating the opioid epidemic by fully supporting community prevention efforts and drug courts to get people into treatment. This bill also provides $115 million for the Abandoned Mine Lands Pilot Program, which helps create economic development in Appalachian coal communities. And finally, Mr. Speaker, as the ranking member of the State and Foreign Operations Subcommittee, I'm especially pleased that this bill includes significant funding to secure our diplomatic posts and to support critical allies like Israel, Jordan, Egypt, Georgia, Ukraine, and others. The bill also continues vigorous oversight of U.S. assistance programs, prohibits funding for the Green Climate Fund, and respects the sanctity of life around the world. This bill is not perfect. It's not everything we wanted, but it's a true product of compromise, and I urge my colleagues to support it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentlelady from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, a member of the Appropriations Committee and a distinguished conferee, Mr. Cuellar.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I certainly want to thank our Chairwoman Lori for her leadership and the staff on both on the Republican side and the Democrat side for working so hard. I want to thank Speaker Pelosi, Chairwoman Roybal Allard, Ranking Member Kay Granger, and of course all the members of the conferees that worked so hard to come up with this bipartisan, bicameral spending package. The conferees worked together to make sure that we seek an acceptable funding solution for both for the different sides that we have. Now, what do we have here? It's a matter of vision. Folks that there are some people that see border as a crisis, and I respectfully disagree with them. There are some of us that live on the border that we see the border as a place of community, opportunity where we raise our families, where we send our kids to school, and where we have trade and tourism. In that place called the border, I will tell you that if you look at crime rates, the border crime rate is lower than the national crime rate. And I'm not going to pick any selected cities like I've done, but I can tell you that I can pick any city, and the crime rate in those cities of some of my colleagues are higher than the border crime rate that we have. So again, we came up with a balance between what those two visions were. And what we did is we found a way to provide technology, ports of entry, find a way to find balance of border security, but at the same time provide security. We on the border, we don't believe in open borders. We want to see smart border security, and I think this is what this bill does. And we were able to get together, and it's a bill that provides funding not only for border security, but keep in mind there are 6 other bills that provide money for ag, money for transportation, education, health care, and because of that reason, Mr. Speaker, I ask all members to vote yes on this conference report. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you so much.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Texas is recognized.
I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Diaz-Balart.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of this legislation. Look, this bill shows that despite our disagreements, when you work through our differences to find common ground, you can break the gridlock. So I want to thank, by the way, Chairman Price for his leadership and his partnership. We have worked together for now over 4 years, and I have gained a special appreciation for his dedication to public service and, frankly, for his deep understanding of the programs under our jurisdiction. And I look forward to continuing working with him and continue developing our friendship. But I would like to say a quick word about Chairwoman Lowy and Ranking Member Granger and the role that they have played in pulling this funding bill together. Look, I've had the privilege, Mr. Speaker, of knowing these two leaders for a number of years now. And what you saw, what all of us saw us achieve in just the last few days is no surprise to any of us in this body who know them well. Now, they only achieved this through hard work, tough compromise, and grit, and they deserve our thanks. Mr. Speaker, let me turn a minute to the transportation and housing investments included in this bill. This bill doubles down our infrastructure investments from the 2018 THUD bill. And frankly, again, it's a second historic down payment to rebuild our nation. With this bill, we provide a total of $20 billion in new funding over 2 years for roads, for bridges, for rails, and for ports. It's a big number. And as I've said before, the THUD bill, it is the infrastructure bill, and maybe the only one that we'll get a chance to vote on. This bill will create jobs, improve the quality of life of countless Americans. And I'm also particularly proud that this bill makes a new investment in port infrastructure with a focus on seaports at high-volume locations. This port program, coupled with other transportation investments in the bill, will create opportunities for American manufacturers and exporters. Mr. Speaker, I'm also proud of the housing portion of this bill. This meets our commitments to help the most vulnerable among us with decent, affordable housing. This is a good bill, Mr. Speaker, particularly if you care about our veterans, our disabled, and our elderly.
The gentleman's time has expired.
I yield the gentleman 1 more minute.
The gentleman is recognized for an additional 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, this bill exceeds those commitments with new funding for the elderly, for the disabled, and for our veterans. And this bill also includes funding to rebuild urban, suburban, and rural communities with block grants fundings. That funding goes directly to the local decision makers, to the local communities. Again, this is a good bill, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank, the leaders for putting this together, and I urge your yes vote on what I believe is a bill that will create jobs, rebuild our communities, and secure our future. And yes, stop the gridlock. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I am very pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from North Carolina, the distinguished chairman of the Transportation, Housing, Urban Development Subcommittee, Mr. Price.
The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Price, is recognized.
I thank my colleague for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of this agreement, a conference agreement, bipartisan, bicameral, averting a second reckless Trump shutdown. This legislation represents the best possible deal to responsibly fund our government, secure our border, while holding true to our values as Americans. This agreement denies the president billions of dollars for an unnecessary wall. It includes a number of provisions to hold the administration accountable, and it boosts funding for humanitarian support for migrants, for alternatives to detention, and for family case management. The bipartisan agreement also includes 6 additional appropriations bills beyond Homeland Security. For example, the Transportation HUD bill, on which Chairman Diaz-Balart and I worked cooperatively for many months. That bill is included in this package. It increases the Trump budget for infrastructure by $23 billion, and it includes investments that were totally eliminated in the Trump budget. Community development block grants, the HOME program, for example, New Starts for Transit, the BUILD program. All these are made whole, having been, of course, eliminated in that earlier Trump budget. These 6 bills were all caught up in the Trump shutdown. They are now salvaged by this agreement. The deal's not perfect, we know that, but it represents the best way to reject the president's outrageous border demand, keep our government open, and address our pressing national needs. So let's send this bill to the president's desk. Then let's fight to overturn this phony national emergency. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Texas is again recognized.
I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Idaho and my friend, Mr. Simpson.
The gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Simpson, is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to support this conference report and commend Chairwoman Loy and Ranking Member Granger and their staffs for the hard work that goes into this. Not many people understand the important and long time that is spent by the staff in trying to put these bills together. I could sit here until the cows come home, which might be shorter than we think if we run out of cows and get rid of those. But anyway, I could talk about the provisions in this bill that are important to Idaho, whether it's the PILT payment or the sage-grouse listing or other provisions, but this is an important bill. What I'd like to bring to my colleagues' attention is a very important section of this conference agreement, Section 7. It is with sadness that this section is included. It honors the late Stephen Sepp. Sepp, as we know, as was known to his friends and colleagues, spent the last 8 years as a senior advisor to the House Appropriations Committee. He was instrumental in the enactment of Section O of the 2018 Consolidated Appropriation Act. I know this division well because it was the fire, borrowing, and forest management reforms I advocated and worked on for several years. STEP steadfastly worked with members, the committee, the administration, and staff over several years to resolve the problems that fire borrowing caused for the Forest Service and the Department of Interior. More than that, he helped solve a problem which threatens the lives and property of people in the West, in fact, all over the country. His strength, his courage, his sense of humor, and his vast knowledge of the federal budget law and rules made him indispensable, especially to his colleagues. Without STEP, Section O would never have passed. Along with my fellow colleagues on the Appropriations Committee, the chairwoman and ranking member, I know our former colleague had a hand in this, Rodney Frelinghuysen. We would all like to express our gratitude to his wife, Diem, the children Ashley and Matthew, for allowing him the many, many hours he spent with us making Congress and the nation better. Our thoughts are with him today as we pass this. I urge my colleagues to support this bill. Let's put the 019 appropriations behind us so that we can move on to 020. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentlewoman from California, a senior member of the committee and a conferee who worked so hard to put this bill together, Ms. Lee.
The gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lee, is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. First of all, let me thank Chairwoman Loy for yielding, but also I just must thank her for her tireless work day and night on behalf of the American people. Also, let me thank our Homeland Security Chairwoman, Lucille Roybal Allard, for her brilliance and her hard work. She pushed hard for a bill that reflects our American values, and I appreciate her leadership. The phenomenal work of Chairwoman Loy and Chairwoman Roybal Allard and all of our leaders, all of the members of the conference committee, and all of the appropriations chairs and ranking members, that work has just been amazing, and I really do salute you for that. This has been a very, very difficult negotiation, but you all did it. This legislation, of course, Mr. Speaker, is not perfect. It's not the bill that I would have written or chosen. And yes, I have serious concerns with several of the provisions which I will discuss. But let me tell you, this bill will keep the government open. It will prevent another shutdown, which caused so much misery for federal workers and their families. And it provides funding for humanitarian assistance, which is desperately needed at the border. What's more, this bill, the package of bills at least, includes funding increases for 6 other spending bills, including housing for people living with AIDS, transportation grants for low-income communities, increased funding for homelessness, and Section 8 vouchers. And as a member of the Department of Homeland Security Conference Committee, I was proud to fight for many of our priorities in this bill, which really reflects our American values. And being born and raised in the beautiful border town, as I've said before, of El Paso, Texas, I understand what it means to live in a border community and why these issues are so important. They speak to our sense of morality and who we are as a country, and yes, as well as our security. With this bill, Democrats held the line. Madam Chair, may I have another 30 seconds?
30 seconds.
The gentlelady is allowed an additional 30 seconds.
We held the line, Mr. Speaker, in denying the President $5.7 billion in funding for an unnecessary concrete wall. Instead, it includes $1.3 billion in border fencing and includes strong language to protect sensitive locations. Last year, I traveled to Brownsville and McAllen, Texas, where I saw the horrors of the Trump administration's family detention jails. I saw children sleeping on concrete floors. It was cruel and inhumane. Not only did we secure $450 million in this bill for humanitarian relief, including enhanced medical support, transportation, and food in our border, we got many, many programs and funding for alternatives to detention. Finally, Mr. Speaker, 10 seconds. Let me just say it's the first step. It's far from perfect, but it does lay the groundwork, which really addresses many of the issues that myself and the colleagues on the conference committee have fought so hard for. So I support this bill and I ask for an aye vote. Thank you again.
The gentlelady from Texas is recognized.
I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Fleischman.
The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise tonight in support of this joint resolution. Earlier today, our colleagues in the United States Senate overwhelmingly passed this bill. I believe it was 83 to 16. But at this point in time, I'd like to begin by thanking my colleagues in the House. Ms. Lowy, the chairman of the committee, Ms. Roybal Allard, the distinguished subcommittee chairman, Ms. Granger, the ranking member, and I have been privileged to serve, Mr. Speaker, as the ranking member, the highest Republican on the House Appropriations Homeland Security Subcommittee. Where were we? From time to time in our great republic, we hit a blip. We have a problem. We run into a difficulty. And we did that in this shutdown. This was a very odd situation. We had actually passed 5 appropriations bills and 7 were left remaining. Mr. Speaker, that put us in a very awkward situation where there was a partial government shutdown. And I heard the rhetoric on both sides of the aisle, and I know it was sincere, but it hurt. It hurt our country, it hurt workers. But we reopened the government, and then in a room, members of the House from both parties, members of the Senate from both parties came together and we convened. There was a wide difference of opinion on that first day. I heard it, I was in that room. Everyone was acting in good faith, strong-held convictions. A lot of naysayers and skeptics and cynics said we weren't going to get there, but we owed it to the American people to get there. And Mr. Speaker, we got there. We didn't get there with a bill that I would have drawn. My bill, candidly, would look more like the bill that President Trump would have wanted. More money for the border security, more money for ICE. But we came up with an agreement that the vast majority of Americans could support, and the vast majority of members in both houses can support. And that's what I think the American people need to look to. Where did we agree? We agreed in this great bill for increased funding for our beloved ally in the Middle East, Israel. Just in this chamber the other day, members of both parties condemned anti-Semitism as we must. We backed that commitment up with our full support and unprecedented funding for our ally Israel. We can all be proud of that. We, Mr. Speaker, came together with a compromise bill that will have some new border wall, not as much as I would have wanted. We'll have more ICE beds, not as many as I would have wanted. But, Mr. Speaker, I've been in this chamber for 8 years. I saw us come together and work together. My colleagues on both sides of the aisle, sometimes our differences are bipartisan, sometimes our differences are bicameral. Today we are going to come together as Americans and pass this bill. It is not a great bill, but it is a good bill. It represents compromise, and it will, I believe, restore the faith of the American people, not only in our institutions, but in our great republic. We can be proud that we came together when they said can't and we said can. So I will vow to continue as we work forward to work with Ms. Roybal Allard, a very fine lady. We view the world sometimes differently, sometimes we view it in a very similar light. But as we go into 2020, we fall under the draconian Budget Control Act, the dreaded sequester. We will have to address that. We will have a debt ceiling vote. The American people need to know our work will not be easier, it will be harder. but let our resolve be to do the work of the American people as we have done today and we will do in the future. And may God bless the United States of America. Thank you.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlelady from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from California, a member of the Appropriations Committee, and a very important conferee, Mr. Aguilar.
The gentleman from California is recognized, Mr. Aguilar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the chairwoman for her leadership throughout this process. It's been 3 weeks, colleagues, since the end of the longest shutdown in American history, 35 days, where we saw friends and neighbors who hurt, where this body didn't do enough to push back against a shutdown that hurt our communities and it hurt individuals throughout this country. This is a compromise bill, and we're here today to reflect that goodwill and that good faith effort of Democrats and Republicans negotiating together to find compromise. But let's talk a little bit about what this bill would do. This bill protects our national security. This bill works to improve the only true crisis that we have at our southern border, which is the humanitarian crisis. This bill invests in technology and in ports of entry. This bill ensures that we have the resources to protect this country. It also unlocks the other appropriations bills that will fund the Environmental Protection Agency, make investments in the census, and make investments in transportation. What this bill will not do, this bill will not fund the president's wall from sea to shining sea, a wall that he said Mexico would pay for. So we tried another path. We tried a bipartisan path of working together to iron out our differences and to come to an agreement, to keep government open, to protect our national security. That was the focus of the conferees, and that is what we sought to accomplish. But we also did two important things in this document. We ensured that the congressional intent was there when it comes to topics that we don't always agree on. And we will ensure, and this body will ensure, that we will hold the administration accountable, that we will provide oversight that hasn't been provided, and that we will ensure that national security is protected. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank Chairwoman...
Gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank Chairwoman...
30 seconds.
The gentleman is allowed additional 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank Chairwoman Lowy and Ranking Member Granger for their leadership throughout this process, for Chairwoman Roybal-Allard, and for Ranking Member Fleischman. And I'd like to thank all of our staff members on both sides of the aisle who worked day and night to make sure that this document was in front of us in a timely manner and that we ensured that we didn't have another shutdown. I urge my colleagues to support this joint resolution, and I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Texas.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentlewoman from Texas for the opportunity. Mr. Speaker, this is bad policy following bad process. 1,100-plus page bill dropped at midnight last night, and we're acting like we can't walk and chew gum at the same time. We're acting like we can't keep our federal government open and fix our border situation. And let's talk about what's happening there, because that's really the problem. At least, if nothing else, we should do no harm. Let's not make the situation worse. Mr. Speaker, this bill provides amnesty for anyone in a household of an unaccompanied minor, and it protects the people who have smuggled those children into the United States and encourage them to do that even more. And even more than that, once they're here, we cut $700 million out of ICE, and we reduced their bed space so there's less people looking for those people that are here illegally. And then when we find the criminals, right, when they've committed some crime, we find them, we can't even keep them. We got to release them back into our communities. City councils are now deciding where we secure our border. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the time, and I urge a no vote. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New York, the chairman of the Commerce, Justice, Science Subcommittee, Mr. Serrano.
The gentleman from New York, Mr. Serrano, is recognized.
Thank you, Ms. Lowy, Madam Chairman. This bill, Common Justice Science, comes in at $71.5 billion, which is $1.6 billion above 2018. One of the highlights of the bill is that it restores many programs that had been zeroed out by the administration, including the Legal Services Corporation, which comes in at over $368 million. NOAA gets extra money for climate research, and we put in $368 million for opioid epidemic issues, which is 336. The president wanted $336 million. We came in at 368. But to me, the greatest accomplishment in this particular part of the bill is $1 billion for the census, to continue to work on the census. This is a major victory, and we thank the other side for agreeing that this is something that has to be done and something that is important for all of us. So I'm asking not only for you to applaud the CJS part of the bill, but also to vote for the whole bill. Thank you.
The gentleman time has expired. The gentlelady from Texas.
I yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Joyce.
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support of this bipartisan conference agreement, and I thank my ranking member for yielding time to highlight the several items in the Interior, Environment, and Related Agencies division of this agreement. I also want to thank my colleague, Ken Calvert, the former chairman of the subcommittee, for his leadership in this bill last Congress. The highlights I'm about to summarize are really a result of efforts to negotiate a reasonable compromise with the Senate and our mutual friend and current chair of the subcommittee, Betty McCollum. Division E of the conference agreement provides $35.6 billion for the Department of the Interior, Environmental Protection Agency, the Forest Service, the Indian Health Service, the Smithsonian Institution, and more than a dozen related agencies. This conference agreement enhances our nation's economic prosperity in many ways. By cutting an additional $15 million to the EPA regulatory programs, by fully funding the payments in lieu of taxes program, which is critical to the counties with federal lands, and by increasing America's investment in its own abundant energy resources. Additionally, this conference agreement promotes health and safety by providing targeted increases to accelerate the cleanup of America's most polluted lands, waters, and airsheds. By providing an additional $300 million for health care, law enforcement, and related programs to honor our country's sacred trust and treaty obligations to American Indians and Alaska Natives. And by providing $3.9 billion for the Department of Interior and the U.S. Forest Service to fight devastating wildfires that threaten our communities and to reduce the severity of future wildfires. Finally, this conference agreement continues to make critical investments in our nation's infrastructure, including $47 million to reduce maintenance backlogs at our nation's national parks, wildlife refuge, and other public lands. $2.9 billion for the Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Loan Funds, and $68 million for the Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act program, which will be leveraged with private investments to finance more than $7 billion in water infrastructure projects nationwide. Personally, I have a vested interest in the resources provided in this bipartisan package. Having grown up in Northeast Ohio, I cherish my memories of fishing and swimming in Lake Erie with my family and friends. My wife Kelly and I have been proud to share the importance of protecting this precious resource with our children. The Great Lakes are one of the greatest natural resources and economic powerhouses in the United States. They constitute the largest group of freshwater lakes on Earth and hold 95% of the United States surface fresh water. The lakes also support over 1.5 million jobs and provide $62 billion in wages annually. Protecting the Great Lakes is not a red issue or a blue issue. Many members of Congress from both sides of the political aisle understand the important role the lakes play in our lives and understand the importance of protecting them. My colleague, Betty McCollum, has been a great partner to work with in my fight to protect the Great Lakes, and I'm happy to report that the conference agreement includes full funding for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which helps us address invasive species like Asian carp, reduce phosphorus runoff that causes harmful algal blooms, and protect and preserve the Great Lakes for future generations. In closing, I want to sincerely thank the staff of both sides of the aisle for their hard work, their professionalism, and their ability to work together under extremely difficult circumstances in order to get an annual appropriation bill over the finish line once again. I also want to thank my many thousands of federal employees that carry out the programs funded in this conference agreement. Your dedication to serving your fellow Americans, in spite of the sacrifices asked of you by your government, especially this year, is the glue that helps bind us all together as one nation. With that, I urge my colleagues to support this conference agreement, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Lowy.
Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Georgia, the distinguished chairman of the Agricultural Subcommittee, Mr. Bishop.
George is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. When I spoke on the floor about finishing the FY19 bills, we were in the midst of what turned out to be the longest government shutdown in our history. Thankfully, that's behind us, but to ensure it stays behind us, we need to pass this conference report. The bipartisan leadership and staffs and the conferees have done an admirable job. This bill is good but not perfect. It makes significant investments in rural development. It includes language setting aside funding for persistent poverty counties. It's a modest increase for farm production and conservation, the mission area. Domestic nutrition programs are all well funded. On the international side, the bill provides good funding for Food for Peace and the McGovern-Dole program. Finally, FDA gets $3 billion, including significant investments to fight the opioid epidemic. But I must say candidly that I have some regrets. My strongest regret, however, is that we are not considering the disaster supplemental today. The House and Senate passed separate bills a month ago that would have provided desperately needed relief to our farmers, ranchers, communities coast to coast in Hawaii and the territories that were devastated by tragic disasters. But those bills must still be reconciled. The country must get this disaster bill passed and get it passed soon. The conferees have done well.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 more minute.
I urge my colleagues to support this bill. It's a good bill.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Granger.
I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Rutherford.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank the ranking lady for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of the compromise appropriations package that includes major wins for our national security and our economic success. In fact, this vote tonight will authorize 7 different appropriation bills that fund critical agencies and programs within our government. Now, this is not the bill that I would have written, and this is probably not the bill that any of my colleagues on the other aisle would have written. But we have all finally found a compromise that Congress can pass and the President has indicated he will sign into law. This is not a loss for the President, but a win for the Department of Homeland Security and a significant step in the right direction for border security. Democrats called for no wall funding. Today we will approve $1.4 billion for new barriers. Democrats called for pro-abortion policies. But today we will approve and maintain multiple pro-life protections. Democrats called for less ICE detention beds. Today we will be approving funding for an estimated 45,000 beds and an additional $750 million for 13,000 beds if needed. We increase ICE funding by $500 million, increase CBP by almost $1 billion, and fund the first Coast Guard icebreaker in over 40 years. This bill strengthens our national security and brings us one step closer to bringing our southern border under operational control. This bill also includes many priorities that are of significance to Northeast Florida. There's $4 billion in additional funding to help FEMA respond to national disasters like Hurricanes Michael and Florence. There's $468 million to help local communities combat opioid trafficking, which has ravaged parts of Northeast Florida. And on the first anniversary of 17 lives murdered in Parkland, Florida, I'm proud to vote in support of $100 million in grants authorized under my Stop School Violence Act, which was signed into law last year. Since the passage of this bill, the Stop School Violence Act has yielded over $175 million in grants to help protect schools across the United States. I understand this is not a perfect bill before us today, but we cannot afford another shutdown that puts almost 1 million people out of work. And we cannot afford another CR that kicks the can down the road, causing uncertainty and increasing the cost of government. Let's end this stalemate, build the wall, and secure our southern border. I congratulate the committee, and I urge my colleagues to support this compromise package and send it to the President. I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. The gentlewoman from New York, Mrs. Lowy.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlewoman from Minnesota, the chairwoman of the Interior Subcommittee, Ms. McCollum.
The gentlewoman from Minnesota is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of this conference committee report. The Interior Environment section provides $35.6 billion, which is $300 million more than fiscal year 2018 enacted. We make critical investments in this legislation in Indian country, environmental protection, public land management, and the arts. The Environmental Protection Agency is funded at $8.8 billion. This funding will enhance the EPA's ability to protect human health and the health of our environment. We continue to invest in land and water conservation fund and civil rights initiative programs and historic preservation. We worked in a bipartisan way to increase funding for the National Endowment for the Arts and the Humanities. And finally, it's critically important that this Interior bill upholds the federal government's trust responsibilities to our Native brothers and sisters. Funding for Indian country is over $1 billion more than the President's budget, and we did it in our committee's nonpartisan way. Programs in the Interior bill impact all of us, from preserving our natural and cultural resources to protecting our health and safety. And, Mr. Speaker, I support this bill, and I encourage my colleagues to vote for it as well.
Thank you. Gentlewoman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Granger.
I reserve my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentlewoman from New York, Mrs. Lowy.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Florida, the chairwoman of the Military Construction Veteran Affairs Subcommittee, Ms. Wasserman Schultz.
The gentlewoman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentlelady for yielding. I rise to support this bipartisan agreement, which, while not perfect, keeps our government open and funds many essential, crucial needs. It also passes sound policy, like one preventing our government from using asylum-seeking children to be used as bait to arrest immigrants seeking to sponsor them. I urge all members to vote for this important compromise. However, I cannot stay silent on the President's threat to declare a national emergency to pay for his boondoggle of a border wall. This lawless end run around Congress is a craven act built on lies and distraction. The President would steal funds we use to support our brave young soldiers just to pay for an ancient monument to waste. Rather than own up to his lie that Mexico would pay for it, Trump would degrade our national security to try to steal his way to his totem to vanity and hate. Will Trump ever look our soldiers and veterans in the eye and tell them that it is they who will pay for this wall of waste? Of course not. If this President wants to compromise our military with this tin pot authoritarian tactic, he's going to have to come through this Congress to do it. I urge my colleagues to vote for this agreement and reject Trump's big national emergency lie. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields. Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities toward the President. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Granger.
Mr. Speaker, I support this conference agreement before us today, and I urge a yes vote. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back the balance of her time. The gentlewoman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks on the conference report to accompany H.J. Res. 31. Mr. Speaker, I yield myself.
That is accepted.
I yield myself the balance of my time to close, and I would like to once again thank my fellow conferees.
Nice. The gentlewoman is recognized for the balance of her time.
I would like to once again thank my fellow conferees. In divided government, none of us will get everything we want, but I'm proud that 16 of us, all appropriators, could work through a series of difficult decisions and sign a bipartisan agreement I urge my friends on both sides of the aisle to vote yes, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Pursuant to House Resolution 131, the previous question is ordered. The question is on adoption of the conference report. Those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The conference report is adopted.
Mr. Speaker, on that I ask for the ayes and nays.
The ayes and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the ayes and nays will please rise. A sufficient number having risen, the ayes and nays are ordered. Members will record their vote by electronic device. This will be a 15-minute vote. And pursuant to Clause 9 of Rule 20, this 15-minute vote on the adoption of the conference report will be followed by a 5-minute vote on agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the journal if ordered. This is a 15-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 300, the nays are 128. The conference report is adopted. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. The House will be in order. The House will please be in order. Members will please take their seats. Members, for what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to speak out of order for 1 minute.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, members are advised that with House and Senate passage of the fiscal year 19 conference report, votes are no longer expected in the House on Friday, February 15th. Next votes, members, are expected on Monday, February 25th, 2019 at 6:30 p.m. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The chair yields back. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the unfinished business is the question on agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the journal, which the chair will put de novo. The question is on agreeing the Speaker's approval of the journal. Those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the journal stands approved. This is the gentlewoman from New York. Seek recognition.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to take from the Speaker's table Senate Concurrent Resolution 4 and ask for its immediate consideration in the House.
The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
Senate Concurrent Resolution 4, concurrent resolution providing for a correction in the enrollment of House Joint Resolution 31.
Without objection, is there objection to the consideration of the concurrent resolution? Without objection, the current resolution is agreed to, and the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Purpose of the gentleman from Oklahoma seek recognition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on the Judiciary be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 962, the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act, and I ask for its immediate consideration in the House so we can defend life.
Okay. Under guidelines consistently issued by successive speakers, as recorded in Section 956 of the House Rules and Manual, the chair is constrained not to entertain the request unless it has been cleared by the bipartisan floor and committee leaderships. The House will please be in order. Members of the House will please take their seats. Does the gentleman from Oklahoma continue to seek recognition?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we've had a bill that's been tied up in judiciary for a long time. It's about defending life. It's about making sure that we do not take away life from people that are unborn. I just ask for its immediate consideration.
The gentleman has not been recognized for debate. Purpose is the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that when the House adjourns today, it adjourns to meet tomorrow at 10 a.m. There will be no votes expected.
Objection to the motion. Without objection, the House will adjourn. So ordered. Now entertain requests for 1-minute speeches. Gentlewoman from New York, rise. Without objection, Chair recognizes the gentlewoman from New York. Order. The House will be in order, please. All members will please take their conversations off the floor.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today during Black History Month to honor...
The House is not in order. Chair requests you please take the conversations off the floor. That's it. The House will be in order. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today during Black History Month to honor a man who represents Brooklyn, New York to the fullest. A trailblazer, an innovator, and a cinematic genius, Brooklyn's own Spike Lee. On behalf of the people of the 9th Congressional District, Mr. Speaker, it's killing me. It's killing me.
Members of the House, please take their conversations off the floor. Yeah. Thank you. The gentlewoman from New York will continue.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today during Black History Month to honor a man who represents Brooklyn, New York to the fullest, a trailblazer, an innovator, and a cinematic genius, Brooklyn's own Spike Lee. On behalf of the people of the 9th Congressional District of New York, I'd like to congratulate Spike Lee, a son of Brooklyn, on receiving the first ever Best Director Oscar nomination despite more than 30-year career in film. He joins the ranks of only 6 other African Americans to ever be nominated for the category. Mr. Lee was raised in Brooklyn and attended Morehouse College, where he received a Bachelor of Arts in Mass Communications. He received a Fine Arts degree from New York's Tisch School, NYU's Tisch School of the Arts. Many of Mr. Lee's films have examined race relations, colorism in the Black community, and the role of the media in contemporary life and political issues. Spike has never ceased to speak out against injustice and in the Black community. He has been outspoken on police brutality, environmental injustice, and other issues that affect communities in Brooklyn and beyond. His love of Brooklyn is reflected in his activism and his work. 40 Acres and a Mule, Spike's production company, is based in Brooklyn, contributing in part to the economy that keeps our city running. He shot films like Do the Right Thing and Crooklyn in Brooklyn, allowing viewers to experience all that we know and love about Brooklyn. Spike Lee continues to produce work that pushes the envelope on topics that need to be discussed. Black Klansman, for which he is being nominated, has received praise and adoration for its topics around combating racism. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Ask for unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, I rise today to honor the life, service, and legacy of my friend and colleague from North Carolina, Walter Jones, Jr. Congressman Jones served the people of North Carolina's 3rd District honorably for more than 2 decades, being elected 13 times starting in 1994. He passed away on Sunday in Greenville on his birthday. Congressman Jones will be remembered for his courage, conviction, and character. He was a man led by his faith, never wavering in his support for the unborn. He was known as a staunch pro-life advocate. He was just as tough when it came to his support of the military. His district covered both the Marine Corps Camp Lejeune and Marine Corps Air Station Cherry Point, and he worked hard to give our servicemen and women a better quality of life. Our country is better off when people like Walter Jones are serving in this body. Please join me in praying for his family and for loved ones throughout this difficult time. Madam Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Let's be clear. Donald Trump's presidency is the real national emergency. President Trump fired the FBI director to protect his national security advisor. He tried to rip health care from millions of Americans and destroy protections for people with pre-existing conditions. He orchestrated the largest transfer of wealth from middle-class families to rich families. And Trump has done nothing in the face of epidemic levels of gun violence and devastating impacts of climate change. Why is Trump lying about a national emergency at the border? He's doing it to distract the American people from the fact that he has no plan to improve health care or improve our schools, or do one damn thing for our working people in this country. And I yield back.
Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities towards the President. The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise tonight in the memory of our friend Walter Jones, Congressman from North Carolina. Walter was a kind, gentle, sweet soul of a man who I admired, even in the brief time we had to serve here together. I found him to be a man of integrity, who always put what he thought was right for the people of his district and this country forward first. Sometimes he had a vote he might regret, but he did everything he could to make that right. He went so far as to make the families feel that much more comfortable with a letter to everyone that he could possibly do, a letter to those families of a fallen soldier, showing the compassion, showing that at least one congressman knows what their pain is. So to his family, to his wife Joanne, his daughter Ashley, all his constituents and friends and neighbors in North Carolina, our hearts are with you at the loss of a man whose main goal was to please God and walk with Jesus Christ. We admire him and we will miss him. I yield back.
Yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to express my relief that the House of Representatives has passed a bipartisan compromise that keeps our government open, secures our border, and upholds our values. Now, this is not an agreement that either party would have written on its own, but rather than funding for an ineffective border wall, this bill instead prioritizes border security funding for methods and technologies that have proven effective. This bill also rejects irresponsible budget cuts and instead invests additional dollars in important priorities like funding for economic development assistance programs and environmental protection and transportation infrastructure. I want to thank all of the conferees for working together to forge a bipartisan consensus to fund government, invest in our priorities, and keep our country safe. It's about time that Congress gets to work on more legislative priorities that will strengthen our families, strengthen our communities, and strengthen our economy. That's what the American people elected us to do, and I hope my colleagues will join me in these efforts going forward. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I, too, miss my friend Walter Jones. I just greatly treasure the hour each week we spent together visiting. It was a fitting tribute today at his funeral. But I do want to address this bill we just passed. I'd hoped to vote for it after I was hearing, well, it's not much money, it's less than $2 billion, but the trouble is there's provisions in here that are going to make it difficult to remove anybody that's here if they got a child in there, and yes, I know there's language that says if it's based on information shared by HHS, so that means they're going to be covered up with discovery requests, FOIA requests. Probably people will find Obama judges that let people out. This was not a good bill in the end. That's why I had to vote no. And I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition? Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, this bill that we came to have to fix as a Republican bill was a compromise, but it was a compromise with humanitarianism and passion and compassion. This border security and funding bill that Democrats fixed did some good things. In particular, It raised the number to 100,000 alternative detention sites for women and children. It provided health care where there was no health care so that little children would not die at the border. And it prevented ICE from using data to deport people who are trying to pick up their children. The good news is our federal employees will not be held as hostages, and we've given them a 1.9% increase in raises. As well, we provided for food for peace for people who are struggling around the world, $1.7 billion. And as a member of the Judiciary Committee, we provided $423 million for the Byrne grant, but $178 million to address sexual assault kit and other DNA, and $100 million for Stop School Violence, and $497 million, Madam Speaker, for the Violence Against Women Act, $75 million for gun control, or at least the checks for background. Madam Speaker, this is a humanitarian bill, and I ask our colleagues to recognize it. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Connecticut seek recognition?
Unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute, revising extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, it's Valentine's Day, and we've all spent the evening together, which is kind of funny. And we did it in the service of keeping the government open with a bill that funds the government in a strong bipartisan vote, and that's a good thing. But, Madam Speaker, Valentine's Day will never again be a truly happy day because, of course, it is the 1-year anniversary of the Marjory Stoneman Douglas shootings in Florida, in which 17 young people with their lives ahead of them had those lives snuffed out at the end of a gun. And it's a particularly poignant moment for me and for those of us from Connecticut because we still can't forget, of course, the 20 children, 6 to 7 years old, and 6 adult staff who lost their lives in December of 2012 at the Sandy Hook Elementary School. So, Madam Speaker, I just rise to point out that we're hearing a lot tonight about an emergency declaration. And if 30 to 40,000 Americans, including these young angels, losing their lives every single year is not an emergency, I don't know what is. This House, after 8 years of inaction and pathetic moments of silence, moved a bill, H.R. 8, for universal background check out of committee yesterday. The least we can do as an institution is to take the small step of passing that bill into law to keep young and all Americans safe. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from New Hampshire seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, I rise today to express my relief that Democrats and Republicans have come together to advance a bipartisan spending measure to keep the government open and deliver for the American people. President Trump's recent irresponsible government shutdown over his demand for an unnecessary medieval wall was misguided and hurt our dedicated federal employees, their families, and threatened our economy. I want to applaud my colleagues, the incredible Chairman Nita Lowey, Representative Pete Aguilar, Representative Roybal Allard, and all of our conferees for their diligent work to reach the compromise bill that we are sending to the President's desk tonight. This legislation promotes 21st century border security and humanitarian support for migrants in detention, alternatives to detention, and family case management. The American people sent a strong message when they elected a Democratic majority in this House in November, and they want Congress to focus on delivering real results that will benefit the lives of hardworking middle-class families. Madam Speaker, I yield back.
Are there any further 1 minute requests? The chair lays before the House the following personal request.
Leave of absence requested for Mr. Quigley of Illinois for today.
Without objection, the request is granted.
Madam Speaker?
For what purpose does the gentlelady from New Hampshire seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I move that the House do now adjourn.
The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow.